All right, welcome back. So, last one on transferring property interests. And in fact, what we look at now doesn't really have to do with transferring property interests, at least not anymore. And that is mortgages. And that's because, as we'll see now, a mortgage does not involve the transfer of title. It involves the title of a property right, in that the right of the person who has a mortgage on, say, real property, so a house, right, is an interest of a property nature. So it's an interest that unites directly the person and the thing. So the bank, for example, who has a mortgage, right, and the thing, namely the house. It's not a transfer of the entirety of the property interest or right, as we saw earlier. That was what we saw with, right, a gift, right? You gave the entire thing. You gave the entire house away, the entire fee simple, the entire title to the house. And we saw something similar there with, right, the deed, and the statute of frauds, which requires the deed to be in writing. And then, right, what happens when the deed doesn't work? That is the doctrine of part performance, which enforces the transfer of a property interest, but almost always title, right, although you do not meet the requirements of the statute of frauds. I say almost always because the statute of frauds applies to other kinds of property interests. For example, in some circumstances, a lease. It's not something we have to get into, right? For our purposes, it has to be in writing. So, a mortgage. Back in the days, it was a transfer of essentially title. So, you gave your house away, you pledged it for some money for a period of time. The person to whom you pledged it, right, as you repaid the loan, got the entirety of title and then gave it back to you, and that's how they made sure they got paid. Doesn't work that way anymore. So, you transfer something that is not title, right? So, I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, if that's necessary, which I don't think it is, but let's do it anyway, right? You have the house, then you have someone, we'll call them me, and then you have, right here, a property relationship. You have a property relationship uniting me and the house. That is, in that case, say there's nothing special, a fee simple. I have the entirety of title to the house. I own the house. It's a fee simple. What do I do there? I pledge a portion of that, right? So you'll recall from day one that it's a bundle of rights, right? That has remained true throughout the semester. So, for example, if you have fee simple, that's the bundle, it's the whole thing, right? It's the best thing you can have. You can give away part of it, namely a life estate. A life estate is a present interest to possession for the duration of someone's life. And you retain, right, a right to get possession back afterwards. You've dismembered the bundle. You used to have both a right to present possession and a right to future possession, right? Now you split them, you keep the right to future possession, and you've given the right to present possession to someone else, namely the life estate. It's the point of the bundle. You've got everything, you can give some of it away, you don't have to give the entire thing away at once, right? So you can dismember it, that's what the bundle means. So, you do that there, you give a portion of that, right, of that relationship there, which is there in my picture, to a third party, which we'll call bank. That's usually who holds a mortgage. So you've given a portion of your interest. That portion of your interest nowadays isn't particularly significant. Certainly it's not title. It used to be title. It used to be the entire thing. It was simple, right? You had a fee simple, you gave it to someone. They were the owner for a temporary period of time, and then if you didn't pay, they remain the owner. If you did pay, you eventually got title back. They had to retransfer it to you because you had transferred it to them. Doesn't work that way anymore. You transfer a very small subset of title, which has basically no consequences until you don't pay the mortgage. So you give the bank a property interest, and that simply, again, can be defined any way you want, right, within that bundle. That is a right to take possession of the house and eventually title to the extent that you don't pay the loan, right? And the loan is in fact kind of something else, right? It's a something else which forces me to cross property there, right? But that's the loan. The loan is something else. It's a contract. It's an agreement between me and the bank. And pursuant to that contract, I have to pay the bank money. Usually the money I got to buy the house, right? That's usually how the whole thing works and why it's good, right? So I have an obligation to pay the bank a large amount of money. That's a contractual obligation. You can obligate yourself to pay someone money by contract. You can do that in a lot of contexts, right? You can go get a loan that's not a mortgage, and then you have a contractual obligation to give money back to someone, say the bank. So you got there. There are two separate things. First thing, right, the loan. You have a contract that says you have to pay the bank back. Then second thing you have, right, often because you use the money out of that contract to buy it, right, is now the fee simple, a property relationship that means that you own the house. And separately, you give a property relationship to the bank. Different there because it's a relationship between the bank and the house. It's a property relationship, and you'll recall, because I said it like 20 times this week and last week, that's the distinction there. Property relationship is between a person and a thing, an entity, in that case the bank, and a thing, not two people like the loan contract. So the obligation to pay back money is between two people. It's contractual. But you also grant the bank a property interest, which is different in that it's between the bank and the house. It's a right that you grant the bank upon the house. And the two will be related in some way, of course, by virtue of the contract. The contract will say the nature of that right. And again, same thing as a deed, right? A deed transfers a property interest, doesn't create it, right? Is not, the nature of the right, to be more precise. So you can transfer fee simple, there's a contract there, right? But the contract is not the right. The right is property. So it's between person and a thing, not the contract itself, which is between two people. So the contract can define the nature of the property interest, which exists, again, independently, and therefore say that the nature of the property interest is that the bank will only get to take possession and eventual title of the house if the loan is defaulted upon, if you don't pay it. And that's a mortgage. Okay, this is why we call it a security, a secured transaction, right? So you conduct a transfer of property, namely buy a house. Then you go to the bank. You ask for money. It's a transaction, it's a loan that is secured by a right that you give the bank upon the house. Secured in that, the bank has a property right in that framework I just laid out that is used to secure, to make safer, a separate contractual obligation, the loan agreement. Hence why we call it a security or a secured transaction. It's in contrast to a right of a purely contractual nature, as is otherwise a loan contract. Again, you can obligate yourself by contract to pay someone money or pay someone money back, and that is simply a contractual obligation. You do have an obligation to pay it back. It's just the person doesn't directly get access to your stuff, right? Eventually they do if you default, but not directly. It's where the distinction arises, and that's how it is safer, right? Which is another meaning of secure, right? It's safer in that the bank will also have priority upon the house. So say you have a lot of debt. In fact, you have more debt than you have stuff, assets. That's what we call insolvency. That's when you cannot pay your debts because you do not have sufficient assets and or income, of course, right, to pay them. Then you can do something we call declare bankruptcy. That's when you tell people that you don't have the money to pay your debts, and you ask for whatever you have to be used to pay the debts, and then the whole thing, right, the rest of it to go away. It's bankruptcy. It's declaring bankruptcy. It's one of the risks of a regular loan, which is again a contractual obligation. The risk is that the borrower, the person, will go out and take out more loans and therefore be unable to pay them back fully. Or the person, right, will go out and spend the money you lent them, therefore no longer have it to pay it back. Or the person will not have a good job, not have the money to pay it back. It's a risk that you don't get paid back. That risk generally means that you're competing against, on an equal footing, other creditors. So if there's lots of people who lend someone money, right, they're all competing for a limited number of assets because insolvency, then, right, you get paid back proportionately. That's not the case when you have a secured obligation. So if the bank has a right on the house becomes separate from what the other creditors can get. To the extent of the obligation, the bank has priority over the house. That's what the security is used for. So, if you don't have money to pay your debts back, the house is not part of all the assets that you'll use to decide what percentage of their money back everyone gets. Because the house has been specifically pledged to a creditor, the bank, therefore, you sell the house, right? Insolvency, you still don't have money to pay your debt. So you got to force the house to be sold, right? To convert it to money, to apply it to the creditor so that you can eventually declare bankruptcy and be released from your obligations because we no longer put you in jail now if you can't pay your debt. We used to, we no longer do. Now you do what we call declare bankruptcy. So, all that to say, you try to declare bankruptcy, what happens? The house gets sold. Once the house is sold, whatever money comes out of that first goes to pay the bank because they have a security. They have a priority, essentially, in getting paid. Therefore, they get paid first, and whatever is left, if anything, goes to pay everyone else. And all that is a subject of a more advanced course, but the basics of it you have to understand. So, the bank is advantaged here, right? It might be that everyone gets 10% of their money. Every other creditor. But because the bank, right, got a security upon the house, the bank might get paid back 100%. Oftentimes will. That's how mortgages work, right? Usually they lend you up to 80% of the value of the house. If it's more, then it's really the government taking on the risk with what we call mortgage insurance. So the bank really doesn't have a risk, right, up to more than 80% of the value of the house. And as you can imagine, very rarely do houses go down 20% in value. So if you default upon your mortgage, right, the maximum theoretical amount you'll owe is 80% of the value of the house, right? And then the bank forces the sale. That costs a bit of money, but not 20% of the value of the house. Therefore, the bank almost universally gets paid back entirely, even when the person is insolvent, and that's the point of having collateral, right, a security interest upon some property. Okay, tons of fun. And you can also have that, of course, with personal property. Same thing, right? You can have a car loan, and your car loan will be guaranteed upon the car. So, same thing, property interest, you have a priority as the creditor over the money that gets generated from the sale of the car because you have a secured transaction. And usually, of course, the interest rate will vary, right? The bank will lend you money for very cheap precisely because of what I just said, precisely because it's very likely that the bank will get paid back even if you're completely irresponsible, even if you lose your job and have no money to pay your mortgage, right? Even if everything goes wrong, the bank is very likely to get paid back, and that's why it's going to be willing to lend you money for very cheap. Okay, so as we said now, a mortgage is a property interest. It's a charge, that's what it's called under the statute in Ontario, which essentially means a property interest that's not title. Property interest that's defined specifically as, in specific circumstances, namely you don't pay the loan, the bank will be able to get possession and eventual title of the house. 540, you have a discussion of mortgage insurance, which we won't get into, but it's basically what I said. The bank will only lend you 80% of the value of the house, right? The government thinks it's favorable for people to own houses, generally because people are irresponsible. So people usually don't save for their retirement. Usually they need at least $1 million not to starve if they retire. That's a problem, right? They need $1 million, they have zero because they spend all their money. Therefore, the government thinks it's favorable for people to own houses because then instead of paying rent, they'll pay down the value of the house, and when they retire, even if they've been irresponsible, they'll have an asset that's worth at least close to, right, at least a portion of $1 million, and they're less likely to starve when they retire. For that reason, the government, right, thinks it's favorable for people to buy houses, tries to favor that. Creates something called the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CHMC, which essentially allows people to borrow money that they otherwise couldn't by providing mortgage insurance, and that is by providing for a down payment upon a house that is less than 20%. So 5, 10, 15, right? And the government insures the mortgages. So essentially the government takes on the risk of default, takes on the risk of the borrower not paying. That's what insurance is, right? So if you default, essentially it's the government paying for it, not the bank. The risk is upon the government. And it has all sorts of issues because very poor people can't even have access to these programs, which is also true with a bunch of other programs, but it's something we can talk about more in class. Okay, then you have a discussion of the equity of redemption. And that was relevant when you had title being pledged, but also when you had essentially the bank executing as a security interest. So bank has either titles pledged. As I said, it's how it initially worked, right? You transferred the fee simple to the mortgagor, the bank. And if you did not, right, if you executed your obligation fully, you paid down the entirety of the loan, got transferred back to you. Same thing if the bank seizes it. So if the bank has just a regular property interest, it can execute it. So the property interest says, if this happens, namely you don't pay for X period of time, the bank can take possession of the house. The equity of redemption is an equitable interest. As we said, an equitable interest is a made-up interest for things to be fair. So the courts make it up for things to be fair, essentially. And it provides that you can get title back if you pay, even when you've been in default, for things to be fair, because we, want people to not lose their house if they ever come up with the money to pay back the loan before it's actually sold. but fors, right? And therefore, you have the equity of redemption. That's essentially what it is, and today it's provided for by contract, regulated, and usually not fully applicable. Okay, 542, traditional mortgage remedy is foreclosure. Foreclosure is when the bank exercises its property interest, the mortgage, by getting possession and eventual title, and therefore, right, eventually be able to sell the property, make money with it, and then use that money to pay back the loan that the person has not paid back. By default, you had to have, quote, a reasonable period of time elapse. So you couldn't have the entirety of the loan become due immediately if the person missed a payment, for example, but it wasn't provided for by contract under the common law, right? The contract would vary the common law. As is discussed, it no longer works that way. You have the detail, page 542, which is a private power of sale. We won't get back to it, but essentially, you don't need the whole thing to happen today because it's provided for by contract. So you don't need to ask for possession, eventual title, and once you have title as the owner, you sell it. It doesn't work that way anymore. The bank can order the sale, essentially, right? And sell it on behalf of the person or without getting full title, and then apply the proceeds. So that essentially means that, right, you shorten the process. You don't have to go through the common law rules because they're provided for by contract, and the balance remains owing, and that's one of the important parts of this. So by default, under the common law, you had a choice to exercise either of your interests there as the bank. You could exercise your contractual interest to get paid. So if the loan was in default, you could sue and try to seize the assets of the person generally, so their bank account, whatever assets they have, just like any other creditor, in fact. As we said, this is a general principle, right? The creditor, if there's a lack of execution, can seize whatever assets there are, but indirectly, right? Not by virtue of a specific security interest, as does, right, the bank which has a mortgage on the house. Or, that was option one, contractually, you sue for the money. Option two was, you got the house by virtue of your mortgage. So you seized the house. And that meant that if the house was worth more than the loan, you kept the money. If it was worth less, you lost whatever balance there was. You couldn't combine the two, right? And it makes sense, right? It makes sense if you make money if the house is worth more, that you lose money if the house is worth less. It doesn't make sense if, right, you make money if it's worth more. If it's worth less, you also get to sue on the contract. Wouldn't be fair. That's how the default common law rule worked. That's been varied such that the balance remains owing. So it was varied both ways, of course. So if the bank forces the sale of the house and there are insufficient funds to repay the mortgage, then the bank can sue for the balance of the loan, the person. Foreclosure, not strictly that because it's what we just discussed, right? But foreclosure does not foreclose, it's a pun there, does not foreclose the bank from being able to get the rest of the money. And in contrast, if the house is worth more, the bank pays down the loan, pays whatever expenses were incurred to execute that sale, but then has to give the money back to the borrower. Page 542 at the bottom again. Okay. Then you have a discussion of registration, so we'll do some erasing there, which is something we alluded to earlier, but which we'll get back to in somewhat more detail. So, as we said, first you have the statute of frauds, which says you have to have a piece of writing. These are two statutes. So, one statute, one law says you have got to have it in writing. That's the law. It's the statute of frauds. So, again, transfer of property interest could happen whichever way. Now there's a separate law that creates an evidentiary requirements which says you've got to do it in writing. So, adds a requirement. Now that you want to sell your house, you can't just sell your house. You have to have a piece of paper signed by both parties. Second law says, whatever it's called, right? Different name in different provinces, exists in all developed countries, all Canadian provinces, says you have to register it. Because, right, all the things we said this semester, we want people to have notice, right? If you want to buy a house, you want to know if the guy owns the house. And that's something the government wants to favor because houses are worth a lot of money. We don't want you to pay 300 grand to buy something that is not the person who's selling it. So we have a registration system which says who owns each house. Therefore, you can check. Also said if there's a big mortgage on the house, such that if you want to grant a mortgage, right, if you want to get a mortgage, on the house, you know. If the guy's already got a 300 grand mortgage on the house, you might not want to give him another one. It's also in the land registry. So the land registry is mandatory, again, by virtue of a law. So not the common law, not all the rules we saw. There's a separate statute, a law, that says you've got to register yourself. For that reason, you've got to register the deed by which you transfer the property interest. So what's that do? It means that you know who owns the house, because if there's a transfer of property, it's in the registry, so you know who now owns the house. Registration. Same thing for mortgages. It's a property interest, has to be registered, right? Or if it doesn't have to be the deed always has to be registered, that's for sure. The mortgage, if in some circumstances is not registered, because it doesn't have to be, maybe, right? Depending on the province, doesn't matter for our purposes. Why is it useful to register if there's no obligation to do so? For it to be opposable to third parties. And that's the same thing as what I said earlier, right? What I said is we want to know who owns the house so that you don't buy a house from someone who doesn't own it. That is opposability to third parties, right? You want your ownership to be opposable to third parties. So registration creates that. It tells everyone what's going on so that you can impute them that knowledge, so that you can oppose your property interest to the world. Now you can say, I own it, not just against the prior owner, against everybody, because it's a property interest and it's been publicized. And therefore, if someone, right, tries to do something fishy with it, so prior owner tries to sell it again, for example, or someone tries to grant a mortgage on your house when it's not theirs, that you can oppose your rightful right to these third parties because there is sufficient notice. Okay, so by default, in law, we said there's principle that says, right, first in time. So, if you sell your house twice, the person who bought it first has priority. We said that at the beginning of the semester. That's also a reflection of the fact that you cannot sell your house twice. Right? The second time, you no longer had a house to sell. But you had the fee simple, you transferred it to purchaser number one. Purchaser number two thought they were buying a fee simple. They were not. Purchaser number one has priority. On top of that, purchaser number two cannot have taken a fee simple because you no longer had one to convey. That's the default rule. Registration will be mandatory, so that situation won't arise. In the medieval times, it might have, right? You might have bought it from the guy twice, right? Two purchasers buy the same house because they don't know it's been sold. Now there's a registry. The registry is mandatory, therefore that situation does not really arise. However, it does arise with equitable interests. Because, as we said, equitable interests are not legal interests. They are made up, oftentimes. Therefore, they are not in the registry and not opposable to third parties. So when you have equitable interests, it gets complicated. Because you'll recall, right, there's the default presumption that it's only opposable between the parties. Okay, sorry, my handwriting is pretty bad. So by default, and that we said, I think last week, is the distinction, the key distinction between a legal and an equitable interest, right? We said, what difference does it make? If we have the example that we had last week, where you have an agreement to purchase, right? So you agree to sign a deed at a later date, often subject to certain very limited restrictions as to, right, the house inspection, for example. So we said if you sign the deed, it's legal, right? It's a legal transfer of ownership that has to be registered, blah, blah, blah. But then we said, if you agree to purchase a house, so you agree to sign a deed at a later date, that, we said, is essentially as though you had signed the deed. Because if you fail to execute your obligation to sign the deed, not only can the parties sue you for damages, they can sue you in specific performance of your obligation and therefore force you to sign the deed. And so the question arises, what difference does it make whether you signed the deed or you signed an agreement to sign the deed? And the answer seemed to be none. Because if you just signed the contract, they could force you to sign the deed, which was the same as if you signed the deed in the first place. But the mechanics by which that happened, you'll recall, was equity. Was because, although the agreement to purchase did not affect the transfer of a legal right, so the fee simple did not pass, because the fee simple passes when the deed's signed. You have not yet signed the deed. Fee simple is not passed. You'll recall we had a drawing for that, right? However, something we made up called equitable title passes. So although legal title doesn't pass, something else called equitable title passes. By virtue of that, you have essentially the same rights passed. That's why the buyer, even though they don't have a fee simple yet, need to insure the house. Because the risk is passed, and that's by virtue of equitable title. The title that passed, right, the made-up title that passed, that allows them to force the deed to be signed, in other words, force legal title to pass. All that, right? So it did make a difference because you got the same thing in the end. Where it did make a difference was in opposability to third parties. And that's because if you did sign the deed, it would have been in the registry opposable to third parties. If you only had an agreement to purchase, you had equitable title. It was opposable as in specific performance to the party against whom you are charging it. So, the seller. You could ask for the house, not just the money. But if the purchaser, you'll recall, sold it to someone else, a bona fide third party without notice, as we call them. So, didn't know, couldn't know. That's what bona fide, good faith, right, without notice means. It means they had no notice, didn't know, and were in good faith, couldn't know. Right? They try to buy the house legally. You could not oppose your right to specific performance against them because they didn't know, couldn't know. And that was a distinction. It was because it was equitable title. It was because it was not in the land registry because you hadn't signed the deed yet, hadn't transferred legal title yet. Therefore, was not opposable to third parties. That's the key distinction between law and equity. And that's why the registry takes its meaning. That's why it gets more complicated when you have equitable interests. Because it's not just a matter of first in time, first in right, because there's no registry, no opposability to third parties. And we'll see there's a very different mechanism to affect that, where you assess essentially the equities involved, which is what the Court of Equity did, right? Trying to do justice, trying to be fair. And in fact, there's a pretty cool principle called the clean hands doctrine, which says you can't get equity if you did something wrong. And that remains true. So for example, you go to the federal court, you ask for mandamus, you ask for the federal court, right? Completely unrelated example. You ask for the federal court to order the minister of something to do something they didn't do. It's an equitable remedy. Well, the federal court can deny that for any equitable reason. So if you've been bad for any reason, the federal court can deny that because you haven't been good and it wouldn't serve justice to order it. And so, in assessing the priority of an equitable interest, you'll assess the equities involved. What would be the fairest transfer out of the two house sales, for example, or house transfers? Which would be the most equitable, the fairest, the most just one to affect specific performance upon? And of course, the second transfer, right, that won't mean it's worth nothing because you'll still have an equitable interest, which is an interest, which is a property interest, which you can sue upon. It's just you'll have to sue for the money, not the house. That's page 545, both what I mentioned on first in time, first in right, and on weighing the equities, which is around the middle of the page. Okay. There's pretty long discussion, pages 545 to 547 of the registry, the nature of the registry, Torrens registry. You don't have to worry about that. But essentially, what there is now is that you have an obligation to register. So it used to be that the registry was optional. So you could register it, and oftentimes you almost always would, because it would have the convenient use of being opposable to third parties. Right now, you could oppose it to third parties because it was public, and even though, right, the third party, the person trying to do something, buy it twice, for example, right, could say, I didn't know you had constructive notice, right, by virtue of the land registry, which said, we impute you knowledge. Because it's public in the registry, it's constructive notice. You know, even if you don't know, because you had to check. So, for that reason, you almost always would register it. Now we have a system that's different where you have mandatory registration. So, you don't have a choice. It's not that you want to do it for the convenient use of opposing it to third parties. You have to register it. And what that means essentially is that, right, the land registry, for all intents and purposes, to slightly oversimplify things, is complete. It tells you all the interests, and therefore you don't have to check anywhere else, and you don't have to get insurance, right, which is how it works in the real world, right? You get insurance because for that uncertainty, whatever it is, that you did not find the thing. So usually because everything's supposed to be in the registry, you don't have to worry about missing something that's not in there. You have to get insurance to insure against that, title insurance, because everything's supposed to be in there. And it also means that you get a definitive picture, not just of, right, the property interests, but by virtue of that, of who owns at the current point in time the thing that you're looking at. Last thing is personal property, which there is also a registry for in most provinces, including Ontario. We won't get into that. Essentially, though, it's different because first you don't have to register each property interest. And that's pretty significant. So, you know, believe it or not, you know, if you're buying a boat on the internet, you don't really know that it's owned by whoever is selling it. Of course, if it turns out not to be, you can sue them, but they might not have any money, right? Same thing if you buy a car, for example. You don't really know who owns it. There's a contract that says, right, I'm transferring you property, but you have no way to know, as you would in the land registry, whether that person actually has ownership. And that's because the registry does not mandate registration of the transfer of personal property. You buy your house, you sell a house, your car, whatever it is, right? Your house, I misspoke it. Your house is in the land registry, of course, right? If it's your car, your computer, whatever personal property, there is no need to register the document evidencing that transfer. Therefore, you have, as a corollary of that, no way to definitively know whether the party selling it is the owner or not. So there is a registry, but it's different in that way. Nonetheless, you can register some interests, usually having to do with debts, right? So if you have a car loan, you'll register it so that the car owner does not sell it to Joe next door, and Joe next door ends up, right, not knowing about the loan. You put it in the registry says this car, and that's how it is often, right? That's why it's different, right? It's not by person, right? It's by thing, as it is for the land registry. So you look for the house, not necessarily the person, but, right, Joe buys the car, is supposed to then know that there's a debt owing on the car, and therefore that he can't buy it free and clear from the prior owner. That's all you have to recall for the personal property registry, and we will stop there for this week.